Chinese American, of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. So I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your weekend to join us in our webinar series celebrating AAPI month. This is a time where we pay tribute to the many generations of the Asians and Pacific Islanders who've been such a critical part of America's history and are very instrumental to our future success. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please mute yourself. There will be time for Q&A afterwards. And if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will get to those in the Q&A session. All right, so we'll get started here. So we're really honored today to have Mr. Martin Gold here as a speaker for our webinar. And Mr. Gold, in 2011-2012, while serving as the chair of Covington and Berlin Government Affair Practice, he was very instrumental in securing adoption of the congressional resolution expressing regret for the Chinese Exclusion Project. For this particular project, he did receive the Covington James C. McKay Pro Bono Award and the Champion of Justice Award by the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. In addition, he has authored many books and articles, including The Forbidden City, Chinese Exclusion, and the U.S. Congress, A Legislative History. It was also awarded the Benjamin Franklin Gold Award by the Independent Book Publisher of America and named an honor book by the Asian and Pacific American Library Association. Mr. Gold will be going through three specific topics today in keeping with AAPI month. The first is about the historical treatment and attitudes of the Chinese and the bigoted and racist attitudes by elected officials that ultimately led to the federal legislation banning immigration of the Chinese to the United States in 1882. And secondly, we're going to hear what inspired him to be involved in the efforts for the congressional resolution expressing regret for the Chinese exclusion laws and his thoughts on the Chinese American experience and the current rise in anti-Asian hate in the country, and how all of us can work together on making this a transformative moment in our history. So, and I'm also going to introduce Helen Ying. She is the Executive Vice President of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and she will be doing a Q&A session after the presentation. So I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Gold for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I see old friends in this group because I have spoken on this topic many, many times, from New York to Honolulu to Albuquerque, Phoenix, Portland, Oregon, and on we go, right around the country. As Melanie has indicated, I was pro bono counsel to major Chinese American organizations that had banded together from about 2009, 2010 until 2012 in the 1882 project. And we were able to achieve success in both the Senate in 2011 and the House of Representatives in 2012 on the objectives of that 1882 project, which was to secure expressions of regret from each house of Congress for a very, very difficult and sad history that we're going to discuss this afternoon. So this is a very sad story with a happier ending, I'll say it that way. But we need to understand the story first. And some aspects of this, which would be how I got personally involved in it, and also some, I guess, views about how we might respond to these kinds of issues in the current day are things that we will handle through questions. But what I'll do now, with Helen helping, on the PowerPoint presentation is to go through a PowerPoint presentation that outlines that history. So everybody is on mute. Let's go ahead. This book, one of the great pieces of American literature, this book is a book that I wrote in 2012 in connection with the 1882 project. And it details all of this legislative history. It's a long book, and unfortunately, it's a long book. Didn't start out with that in mind. But when people hear the Chinese Exclusion Law or the Chinese Exclusion Act, they're really thinking of one piece of legislation. In fact, we're talking about 8 pieces of legislation, 6 of which became public law, 2 of which were vetoed. And so the history is therefore necessarily more complex, and the book is therefore necessarily longer. But we'll go through this history now. First slide, Helen, please. I want to begin before the beginning. I want to begin before 1882. I want to go back to 1870, because it's actually a seminal moment in the history of Chinese exclusion in the United States. This is a photograph of Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Sumner was a very strong anti-slavery man. He was what they called in the day a radical Republican. He was for basically the eradication of the old racist systems in the southern United States. Go back, please, thank you. And so in 1870, Congress was considering amendments to naturalization laws. The Naturalization Act of 1790, passed in the first Congress of the United States, said expressly that only white people could be naturalized. And in 1870, the law is being revised, and much has changed in the intervening period. The Civil War has happened. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have been ratified into the Constitution. The law is out of date. So on July the 2nd, 1870, Charles Sumner stands on the floor of the Senate and presents this amendment, which says that the word white shall be stricken from the naturalization laws, and that no person in the United States shall be denied the right to naturalize on the basis of race. That day, the Senate passed the amendment. Then a senator from Nevada rose. His name was William Stewart. We will see him again in this presentation. But William Stewart rose because he's got a problem now. There are about 100,000 Chinese on the Pacific coast of the United States. Some had come as miners during the California Gold Rush. Many more had come to build the Transcontinental Railway. Many of them had remained on the Pacific coast in what is otherwise a lightly populated region. You had 3 of those Pacific coast states in the United States then, with very small electoral votes. California had 6, Oregon had 3, Nevada had 3. That's it. So if we allow these Chinese on the Pacific coast to naturalize and become citizens, it is going to have a big effect on the politics of the Pacific coast, as well as perhaps be a deterrent to white labor migrating to the Pacific coast to work there. So he says expressly, if the Sumner Amendment is not pulled out of this bill shall not pass. Now, it was July 2nd. They were looking to a July 15th adjournment at that time. On the 3rd, it was a Sunday. They didn't work, but they came back on July the 4th, 1870, and tried to get through this. And Stewart, with a little help from a few friends, kept up the filibuster. There was no mechanism at that time in the Senate rules to address the issue. So he was either going to desist from the filibuster, or the bill was going to die, or the Sumner Amendment was going to be retracted. And that is what happened. The Sumner Amendment was retracted. Then, just before the bill passed, a senator from Reconstructionist Alabama put an amendment in to allow people of African descent to naturalize. These are not people who were born in this country as slaves, because they were birthright citizens on the basis of the 14th Amendment. These are people who were not born in the United States, who had come at the end of the slave trade from Africa and then therefore were not covered by the 14th Amendment. So that amendment passed by one vote in the Senate, and then it was finished. And when it was all over, one of the senators said, well, we knew that there was some controversy about the Chinese provision. So we decided to take care of these in 2 segments. And in 2 segments, they did take care of them. But the problem is that the 2 segments were 73 years apart. No person of Chinese descent born anywhere in the world other than in the United States itself could become a citizen of this country until the Chinese exclusion laws were repealed during the Second World War in 1943 as a war measure. So the result of the Sumner Amendment being defeated, retracted, is that political rights that would otherwise potentially have accrued to Chinese living in the United States were not available to them because at least ones who were born out of the country could not be citizens. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about a period of years when the Chinese exclusion laws were put into effect, but this was the period 1882 to 1904 and for years thereafter. And it says in the slide, and this is completely so, Americans welcomed Europeans during this period. There were restrictions put on immigration after the First World War, but during this period, America was wide open to Europeans. My own family came from what is present-day Lithuania and Belarus, what was then Tsarist Russia, in the early years of the 20th century, when Chinese were excluded, but Europeans were not, from places that look very similar to the village that you see on the top of this slide. So restrictions on immigration, much less naturalization, were directed at the Chinese, not at everybody. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about 3 periods here. Pre-1882, right, what was done before the Chinese exclusion laws came into effect, 1882, the original Chinese Exclusion Act, and then post-1882. Because as I said, there were a number of enactments, reauthorizations of the law, which had a limited time expiration, and then it was reauthorized, extended, and not just extended, but also tightened. So we will talk about all that. Next slide, please. Keep going, Helen. Yes, and one more. I think, yes, okay. Prior to exclusion, there was inclusion. Something called the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. Now, you know that particularly in the aftermath of the Opium Wars, there were a number of treaties signed between Western powers and China that the Chinese government did not like and really opposed and considered as unequal treaties and bore a grievance against for ever thereafter. But this is not one of them. Anson Burlingame was originally an American representative in China, and then he was the Chinese representative to America. So Burlingame, California is named for him. Anson Burlingame negotiated a treaty that would allow for the free and voluntary movement of peoples between China and the United States, because the people who came before 1868 just came. They didn't come under the framework of any treaty. And the other important fact about the Burlingame Treaty is that it affirmed that the Chinese who were in America would be granted all the rights and privileges accorded to citizens of the most favored nation. Now, most favored nation is a term presently used in trade law, like now it's become normal trade relations, most favored nation. But what this really means is that if a Chinese person is in America, he's got the same rights and privileges as someone who came from England, or someone who came from France, or any place else. And that's a very important concept. So both of those concepts, free movement of people, most favored nation, are affirmed in the Burlingame Treaty. Next slide, please. And one more, and one more. Thank you. This is Hamilton Fish. He is the Secretary of State under President Ulysses Grant. And he's talking about the Chinese who have come just about now finishing up the transcontinental railway, right? And what does he have to say about these early immigrants from China? Every month brings thousands of them to the Pacific coast. You know, they earn the goodwill and confidence of all the people that employ them, because they're hard workers and they're trying to do their best, do the jobs they are given and so forth, and they are doing their best. And it's good for the United States. So again, before there is exclusion, there is inclusion. This is just in the aftermath of the Burlingame Treaty. So what happens then? What happens then is an economic reversal. Everybody knows about the Great Depression of the 1930s. How about the Great Depression of the 1870s? It's not as big a deal as the 1930s Great Depression, but severe it was. And there were big economic downturns in this country, and all of a sudden jobs are not so plentiful anymore. And there's competition for scarce jobs and competition for wages and all the rest of it. What are you going to do? And so in California, that situation becomes acute. And all of a sudden now the Chinese are not so welcome any longer. So California tries to figure out if there's some way that they can deal with this problem. Can they exclude Chinese immigration? Well, the federal courts say, sorry about that. That's a federal issue, not a state issue. You can't do that. So as a result, California begins to petition the US Congress to pass legislation to restrict Chinese immigration. Starts out as an economic problem. Congress is not sure what to do about that. So they don't do anything right away. Next slide, please. And one more. There we are. Nope, back. Thank you. They send a commission to California to investigate the problem. The head of the commission is a senator from Indiana named Oliver Morton. He makes a report in 1876. And he said, look, these people are subject to ostracism. They can't be protected in their alien condition. They're not citizens. They don't have representation in the legislature. They don't have representation in the Congress. They can't vote, and they're surrounded by enemies. What rights have they? I mean, they can go to court. They can do that, but they don't have political rights. So he said, something should be done about that. Well, something should be done about that. Something was done about that, but it wasn't what he thought should be done. Instead, what was done was the idea of beginning an exclusion policy. So, next slide. And the first piece of anti-Chinese legislation that actually passes the United States Congress passes in 1879. It's a very simple piece of legislation. It's called the 15-passenger bill. What does it mean? It means that no ship can dock in the United States if it has more than 15 Chinese passengers on it, kept on a separate manifest. Okay. This president vetoed that bill. Rutherford Hayes, President of the United States, 19th president, vetoes that bill on the basis of what? That it's a bad policy? Well, not exactly. That it violated the Burlingame Treaty. You can, in Congress, legislate in contradiction to treaties. And a piece of legislation and a treaty stand on the same legal footing. So the latest one in time prevails over the earlier one. You shouldn't really pass legislation that violates your treaty commitments. You should be consistent with your treaty commitments. But if you in the Congress want to run amok and violate your treaty commitments, you can do that too. So when the 1879 15-passenger bill was pending in the Congress, people made the argument that it violated the treaty, and the Congress didn't care, because what they wanted to do was to pass this bill. And Hayes vetoed the bill on the basis that it did violate the treaty, and then they were unable to override the veto. Now, I want to make a point here about why Congress took an interest in this. It is a natural thing, I think, to just ascribe it to racism. And believe me, if you read the congressional record, you'll be sorry you did, because you will see lots of racism in that congressional debate, even if you keep in mind the fact that it was the 19th century and not the present day, and people don't talk today like they did then. Still, there's evidence of racism written throughout those debates, so there's plenty of that. But there is another factor I just want to bring out to put a context around this. The southern states that had been excluded from the Union as a result of the Civil War were reconstructed into the Union by the time of the 1880 presidential election. All the states were back. And now the electoral, particularly close, after when those states were out of the Union, is now very, very close. 1876, the Electoral College was decided, that election that Hayes over Samuel Tilden was decided by one electoral vote. 1880, 84, 88, and 92, we had very similar situations. Another time in 1888, the electoral count and the popular vote had different winners, and it almost happened again in 1880. So the point is that now the politics in this country are very divided and very competitive between the parties. Who's going to win the votes on the Pacific Coast? The Republicans or the Democrats? And both of them want to compete for that vote. And so both of them take a uniformly anti-Chinese exclusionary position, trying to appeal to the people who can vote on the Pacific Coast, and that's not the Chinese. And as a result of that, those votes are up for grabs. When you see the Electoral College decided by a single vote, you start to think about the 12 electoral votes on the Pacific Coast, and you convert what is otherwise a quote unquote local issue into a national issue. I dare say, people in the Congress who are voting, whether they're from Wisconsin or Ohio or Tennessee or Kentucky, whatever, at that time in their history, probably never met a Chinese person. What do they care about this? But they care about it because it matters in the West Coast and it matters in the national elections. That converts a local issue to a national issue. So apart from the basic idea that this was racist and all the rest of it, which it was, there is also that political overlay, which is also very, very important. So now next slide. One more. Back. Thank you. President Hayes vetoed the bill because he knew it violated treaty commitments, but he also knew what the sentiment in Congress was. So he sent a commission to China to negotiate some modifications in a treaty. And these modifications, which the Chinese government was not in love with, but acquiesced to, did permit the Congress to regulate, limit, or suspend Chinese immigration for a reasonable period of time, whatever that means, but not to prohibit it. And the United States, in negotiating, said, we'd be very, very careful how we do this, which they weren't. Okay. Now, what about the Chinese already in the United States? So can they come and go? Yes, they can come and go. The treaty says that they will be given rights to come and go back and forth if they were already legally here in the first place. And so that's the Angel Treaty. And that will be the operating document for a number of years. Next slide, please. Armed with this power, Congress went to work. And in 1882, in the early part of the year, they wrote a bill called the 20-Year Chinese Exclusion Act. They suspended immigration of all Chinese labor, skilled and unskilled, for 20 years, an entire generation. They also prohibited federal and state courts from naturalizing Chinese persons. There was a California congressman named James Farley who did that. Now you say, well, why is that necessary? Because didn't the Sumner Amendment go down years before? Yes, it did. But there was anecdotal evidence that courts in Massachusetts were on some basis naturalizing Chinese people anyway. And under the full faith and credit provisions of the Constitution, courts in California would have to recognize the citizenship granted by a court in Massachusetts. So to make sure that nobody could do that, Farley put an amendment in that said, no federal or state court can naturalize a person of Chinese background. The legislation provided for return certificates for the Chinese legally in the United States, implementing that provision from the Angel Treaty. But this president, Chester Arthur, America's 21st president, vetoed that. Why? He didn't think that was consistent with treaty commitments either, because the length of the and breadth of the restriction seemed to him to be unreasonable in context of the treaty. So the veto is not overridden. Next slide, please. And I just want to show you for a moment before we move forward the fact that this was controversial to a point, right? The 20-year bill passed the Senate, 29 to 15, 32 people not voting. It passed the House 167 to 66, 59 people not voting. The veto override, which needed 2/3 in the Senate, didn't get 2/3. So therefore the veto held up. Now, there obviously the votes to do this, but it's not such an overwhelming number yet. It's going to become a whole lot more overwhelming than that. So it was originally controversial to some degree, because this was a brand new policy imposed on nobody else. Next, please. So armed with this power and facing the veto, Congress comes right back. And so, well, Mr. President, if you think 20 years is too long, how about 10? 10 is the will of the Congress. Chester Arthur can live with that. So this law looks a lot like the 20-year law, just a shorter time frame. It prohibits the naturalization, suspends immigration for 10 years. It gives the return certificates, and it provides a framework for later laws targeting Chinese immigrants. Next slide, please. So here's the vote this time. As you can see, it's less controversial. And so the House passes it with a big vote. The Senate passed it with a few amendments. The amendments went back over to the House. The House, just by a voice vote, all those in favor say aye, concurs with the Senate amendments. So that ends any disagreement between the chambers. Down it goes to the president, and he signs it on May 6th, 1882. Next slide. Once this is done, the controversy is just going to ebb away, because now it's policy, and now the rest of this is law enforcement. So in 1884, Congressman Barclay Henley of California sponsors an amendment to the 1882 Act that says we need to watch Chinese who come in through other places other than just from China. In other words, they come in from Canada. They go to Canada first, they cross the border. So they changed the law to apply exclusion to all persons of Chinese origin attempting to enter from anywhere in the world, not just from China. That's law enforcement. Okay? It passes the House by this number. Look at this. You see? The number of non-voting is an interesting number there. I mean, it doesn't necessarily show that people were just abstaining, but I think there were probably a number of people who did abstain. But by this point, the safe position was to vote for this thing, not to vote against it, right? Or maybe you just don't get on the record. Okay, in 1888, another treaty is attempted. Here's one more. One more. There we go. There's a lot of anti-Chinese violence in the United States. Washington State, Wyoming, California, other places, right? So China and the United States enter into a proposed additional treaty. This one is going to have a 20-year ban on all Chinese worker immigration to the US. However, when the treaty went to the US Senate for its consent, the Senate doesn't just have to vote up or down on treaties. They can add terms and conditions. And if they add terms and conditions, the president can figure whether or not he wants to try to ratify the treaty under those terms and conditions or to forget about it. More than 40 treaties in American history have not been ratified by foreign governments because of conditions that the Senate added, and this is one of them. So the Senate added amendments that were put some restrictions on the return certificate because they thought they were being abused. And when China saw that, they said, this is not the treaty we negotiated. So they refused to ratify the treaty, leaving the Angel Treaty still in force. And then without this as a legal basis, Congress decided it had to act again, and it did act again in 1888. Next slide, please. Something called the Scott Act. I think that's it. Yeah, there we are. Congress acts all by itself after China doesn't ratify Bayer-Jack. In other words, sure, we'd like to do it by treaty. If China's not willing to do that, it's not going to stop us. We're going to control our own immigration. So it's sponsored, in this case, by a congressman from Pennsylvania. And it imposes an absolute cancellation of all of the return certificates, completely violating and overriding the Angel Treaty. About 30,000 people were stuck overseas because they couldn't get back into the United States, in as much as the return certificates they were carrying, which were legal paper on their way out the door, were not legal when they tried to come back because of this legislation. Look at the vote. Look at the vote. It passes the House by a voice vote and the Senate by this overwhelming vote. No longer controversial. Next. So in 1882, Secretary of State Thomas Bayard, who you see on the left, reports that China will not ratify the Bayer-Jack Treaty, and the president on the right, Grover Cleveland, he signs this legislation into law, just basically ignoring treaty obligations. Next. In 1892, the 10-year exclusion law is going to expire. Might they not renew it? Not a chance of that. They're going to renew it. And so as a result, the question is, renew it under what terms, what conditions? Just a simple renewal or more? And the answer is more. Thomas Geary is a congressman from California. He sponsors the legislation. It extends the exclusion policy for 10 more years. It requires Chinese for the first time to carry certificates of residence. Certificates of residence. You have to have papers on you to demonstrate that you have a legal right to be in the United States. If you get picked up, you can show your paper. If you don't have your paper, you're presumptively deportable. I think there's another bullet on this one. Oh, there we are. So now you say, well, wait a minute now. I don't have the paper, but I have witnesses. Let's go to court. I'll prove that I have a right to be here. Congress mistrusted the Chinese testimony. So they put into the law that it had to be corroborated by one credible white witness. That's in the statute, one credible white witness. And if you couldn't establish the case, therefore you were presumptively deportable, you had a year in jail before you were deported, then you were kicked out. So that's the Geary Act, not just an extension. Next slide. Yeah, that's a year in prison. A new treaty in 1894 to override the Scott Act, which is a bone in the throat of the Qing government in China. It's got a 10-year ban on worker immigration. It allows the return certificates to be revived under certain conditions, the ones written here. It exempts from the treatment of exclusion policy narrow categories of people. Who are they? Diplomats, tourists, because they're not staying anyway, right? Students, because they're not staying anyway. Teachers and merchants, but the teacher is not, say, a secondary school teacher. The teacher is a university specialist. A merchant is not a guy with a push cart. A merchant is a guy with a storefront. So you have narrow categories of exemption that are reinforced by administrative regulations that will be written by the executive branch. But it does replace the Scott Act. So return certificates are again living. 20 years it's in effect. In 1902, it's time for another extension because the Geary Act is going to expire. So with the Gresham-Young Treaty in effect, Congress just says, well, we'll extend it indefinitely so long as the Gresham-Young Treaty lives. The Gresham-Young Treaty had a 20-year lifespan, but either party could exit after 10. That's how it went. In 1902, there was a failed attempt by the House of Representatives to codify very severe administrative regulations. In other words, you had the statutes and then you had a pile of regulations on top of the statutes. Regulations, as we know from the change in administration from Trump to Biden, can be easily changed, right? They could be changed again. So who knows what might happen with a new administration coming in? Congress decides best idea, or the House does, best idea is let's codify the administrative regulations so they cannot easily be changed. That's a very restrictive policy. The House passed legislation like that, even though it says a failed attempt. It was failed only because the Senate didn't agree to it. Okay. The other thing is the birthright citizenship case under the Constitution that you know about, I think many of you, is Wong Kim against the United States. It's based on a Chinese immigrant, or a Chinese person, rather, not an immigrant. Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States to parents who could not themselves be American citizens. He left the United States. He came back. He wanted to be admitted into the country. They said, you can't come in. He said, what are you talking about? I'm an American citizen under the 14th Amendment because I was born here. And litigation followed, and the Supreme Court affirmed that Wong Kim Ark was in fact an American citizen because the words of the 14th Amendment should be taken on their face. But that did not please the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives, Champ Clark, who was later to become the Speaker of the House, Champ Clark of Missouri, said, well, I don't like the way Wong Kim Ark was decided. I'll give the court another chance to decide it. So they put a provision in that would absolutely have violated that Supreme Court decision so that they would provide a basis for another challenge and see whether they could get the court to reverse themselves. And the House did pass that, but the Senate did not agree. Please, next slide. So therefore, what happened in 1902 was largely an extension of the old law rather than a further complication. In 1904, this all becomes permanent law. China is fed up with the Gresham-Young Treaty, renounces it. So now, since the 02 law was tied to that treaty, Congress said, well, we won't tie it to the treaty anymore. We'll just make exclusion a permanent policy. And so in 1904, the last of these exclusion bills passes, making exclusion a permanent policy. Next slide, please. This is William Stewart. This is the senator who filibustered the Sumner Amendment in 1870. He did not have continuous service in the Senate, but after a break in time, Nevada sent him back to the Senate again, and he was still a senator in 1904 when they made the laws permanent. And he makes a floor statement, and he says, these are his words. If they had been allowed to be naturalized and become voters, there probably never would have been any exclusion, but then there would have been great trouble. Right? So if you cannot see the connection between the absence of political rights and the presence of ostracism, the very thing that Oliver Morton warned about in 1876, William Stewart connects the dots for you. Next slide. China reacted to this. One more. China reacted to this. Robert Zoellick, who's formerly Undersecretary of State in the United States, wrote a very interesting book just about a year ago, but he talked about this particular development. He said that the United States provoked a reaction in China that President Theodore Roosevelt tried to tamp down and tried to react to, right? After seeing the Chinese exclusion laws become permanent, there were anti-American boycotts in China. President Roosevelt tried to counter the wave of anti-Chinese wave by saying we cannot expect China to do us justice unless we do China justice. But as Zoellick said, the damage had been done. Next slide. A little bit about political context. This is a congressman from Missouri in 1888. 1888 was a presidential election, one of the ones when the Electoral College and the popular vote were opposite. It's an election year, so what are we doing here? It's the year of the Scott Act. He says a campaign doesn't appear to be complete without additional Chinese legislation. So it's a scapegoat at this point. Next slide. This is an extremely interesting person. Many of you, I think, may not have heard of him. My students at George Washington University have not heard of him. But you all have heard of him now, because I'm going to tell you about him. James G. Blaine of Maine. He is one of those prominent people of the 19th century. He was a congressman from 1863. He became Speaker of the House. He became a United States Senator. He was the Republican presidential nominee against Grover Cleveland in 1884, and he was Secretary of State under 3 presidents. Prominent guy. He hoped to be the Republican presidential nominee in 1880. And although the Northeastern Republicans were the group in the Congress most opposed to Chinese exclusion, they were the remnants of the Charles Sumner, Abraham Lincoln Republican Party. Blaine was one of them, but he also wanted to be president. So he wanted to compete for those votes on the Pacific Coast. So he makes a statement in the context of the 15-passenger bill. He says, we have this day to choose whether we will have for the Pacific Coast the civilization of Christ or the civilization of Confucius. His idea was, these people who are coming from China are not immigrants like we know them from Europe. The people from Europe easily assimilate into our population, but the people from China won't easily assimilate. They look different, they have different habits, different clothes, different religion, different whatever. They're too different. They are an unassimilable population. Therefore, they should not be naturalized. And if they cannot be naturalized, you should not just admit them as workers. Because if you just admit them as workers, you will have on the Pacific Coast a seething mass of discontented people with a grievance that you cannot resolve. Okay? So if you won't admit them to become citizens, you shouldn't admit them at all. That statement that he made was the first time that that concept was surfaced in congressional debate, but it was surfaced again in later debates, as a basis to keep them out. In other words, an unassimilable population should not be admitted for any purpose. Next slide. They weren't all villains. Here's William Rice of Massachusetts, one of the Northeastern Republicans I was talking about. He wants to protest the 20-year exclusion law, right? But they don't have the votes, right? So the protest is in vain. Next one, please. This is Robert Hitt of Illinois. Robert Hitt, as a young man, was a law clerk to the lawyer Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. And then later on, he became a member of the House of Representatives. He is complaining about the Geary Act, the idea that you have to keep papers on you at all times to prove your legitimacy of being in the country. He says it's just like the days of slavery when people had to have documents. That's what it amounts to, he said. So we've never applied this kind of a rule to a human being, except with the exception of the sad days of slavery. Again, he votes no, most people vote yes. Next one. And then there's this senator. So this is George Frisbie Hoerr of Massachusetts. He's a descendant, he's a New England blue blood, okay? He's a descendant of Roger Sherman, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, the creator, one might say, of the United States Senate and the Connecticut Compromise that provided for the equality of states in the Senate. That was his grandpa. George Frisbie Hoerr served in Congress for a long time, but he was a senator from 1877 until 1904. And so therefore, a senator for this entire era of Chinese exclusion legislation. And this is what he did. He voted against it all. He voted against it all. In 1902, he was an old man. And the debate went on for a week on the floor. Not whether they should have exclusion or not, but what the policy should look like. Should it be severe like the House, or maybe a bit more moderate like the Senate? He stands up at the end of the debate, 5 minutes before the vote, and he says, here's the problem, not with the details of this legislation. It's my problems with the principle of this legislation. And he makes this statement. I hold that every human soul has its rights dependent upon individual personal worth and not dependent upon color or race, as this bill violates that principle. I am bound to record my protest if I stand alone. Next slide, please. Here's the vote. One negative vote. He stood alone. You possibly can't see that on that screen, but 76 senator vote nay, back one, and one senator votes nay. And that is why the book Forbidden Citizens is dedicated to him. Next slide. This is Henry Nathan. He's a congressman from Massachusetts. He summarizes the Chinese exclusion policy so well, even though he voted for it. This was not a lament, this was a justification, okay? He was a two-term congressman at the beginning of the 20th century. And here's the basic idea of this. With everybody else, besides the Chinese, we don't let everybody in. If you are sick, if you have a disease, if you are a pauper, if you are a criminal, we keep you out. So in those cases, we admit the people, but we exclude the individuals. If you're Chinese, it's just the opposite. If you're a merchant, right? If you are a student, right? We might let you in under one of the narrow exceptions. In those cases, we admit the individuals, but exclude the people. That's the policy in a few sentences. Next slide. Well, he shouldn't show up again. We don't like him. Next slide. There we go. By 1943, of course, the situation with China has changed. China is now a wartime ally of the United States. Madame Chang came to the United States in 1943, really 42 and 43, to campaign for more assistance to China in the war against Japan. She spoke separately on the floor of the Senate and on the floor of the House on February the 18th, 1943. Here she is with Speaker Sam Rayburn. And this is a video. So I'm going to play it just so you can see the reception she got. Is it audible? Helen? Or not?
Yes. Glorious opportunity of carrying on the pioneer work of your ancestors beyond the frontiers of physical and geographical limitations. You have today before you the immeasurably greater opportunity to implement these same ideals and to help bring about the liberation of man's spirit in every part of the world.
In that year, President Franklin Roosevelt asked the Congress to repeal the Chinese exclusion laws. So we can go to the next slide. There we go. There's a few lines. One more. No, back. That's it. Sorry. Okay. The Democratic leadership in the Congress looked for a Pacific Coast congressman who could sponsor this. And this is the guy, Warren Magnuson, then a congressman from Seattle, later a six-term senator from Washington State. Since Chinese exclusion emanated from the Pacific Coast, they felt it was desirable for the repeal to also emanate from the Pacific Coast, and that's why they chose Maggie, as they say. So he was the one that sponsored the Magnuson Act, which was the repeal of all that body of Chinese exclusion legislation. Next slide, please. And on December 17th, 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt, who has just come back from his first Big Three meeting with Churchill and Stalin in Tehran, comes back and finds this on his desk, and he signs the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Laws. That photograph of Roosevelt with Francis Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, is taken on that exact day, December 17th, 1943. Next. And this brings us to the present day, or near present day, decade ago already. It's incredible to me. But anyway, on May 26, 2011, identical resolutions were introduced in the Senate and in the House. In the House by Representative Judy Chu of California, the first Chinese American woman to serve in the Congress, and in his Republican co-sponsor was Judy Biggert of Illinois. In the Senate, the prime sponsor was Scott Brown of Massachusetts, and his co-sponsor was Dianne Feinstein of California. Both Judy Chu and Scott Brown were at that time freshman members of the minority party in their chambers. Next slide. What do the resolutions do? This. They provide a synopsis of historical facts. They acknowledge Congress's role in harming the civil rights of Chinese people. They express regret for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Laws. They appreciate Chinese and immigrant contributions to the nation, and they affirm Congress's responsibility to protect the civil rights of all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. Next slide. What do they not do? They do not seek monetary reparations. They don't discuss persons of other races or ethnicities. And one could, of course, always broaden this out, and maybe justifiably so, but there was enough to work with here, as you can see, I think. So rather than try to keep it very broad, we kept it confined to what Congress did to a specific class of people. And for that reason as well, it does not commemorate actions that are not taken by Congress. Whatever the San Francisco Board of Supervisors did or somebody else did, it's not the subject of these resolutions. It also does not address illegal immigration. So, next slide. This was the very simple passage in the Senate. You will hear Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid add an amendment to this. The amendment was an amendment demanded by some senator who never identified himself, that said we want to put express language in that says no reparations. Nobody was looking for money, so that wasn't an issue. But here we go.
I ask unanimous consent that the Judicial Committee be discharged from further consideration and the Senate proceed as Res 201.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 201, expressing the regret of the Senate for the passage of discriminatory laws against the Chinese in America, including the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the Brown Amendment at the desk be agreed to, the resolution be as amended be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion reconsidered be laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Next slide. This is the next to the last slide. There's one more after this. This is the House of Representatives, and you'll hear Judy Chu talking. So this is a process called suspension of the rules. They needed a 2/3 vote in the House, but there was no objection anyway. Go ahead and play it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within
This
which
is Lamar Smith, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee.
House Resolution 683 currently under consideration.
Without objection. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I first want to thank the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, for introducing H-Res 683, expressing the regret of the House of Representatives for the passage of laws that adversely affected the Chinese in the United States, including the Chinese Exclusion Act. I know through conversations with several of my colleagues, including the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Berman, that this is an important resolution for them and their constituents.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of House Resolution 683. First, I want to thank Chairman Lamar Smith and Subcommittee Chair Trent Franks of the Judiciary Committee for all their work on this resolution. I appreciate it so much. We have come together across party lines to show that no matter what side of the aisle we sit on, Congress can make amends for the past, no matter how long ago those violations occurred. It is because we have worked together in a bipartisan way that we will make history today. Today, for the first time in 130 years, the House of Representatives will vote on a bill that expresses regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 683? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Next slide, and that's the last slide. In 1879, the 15-passenger bill came through the House Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And this person was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but he was opposed to the legislation. And he opposed it on the floor. His name was Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. He was Abraham Lincoln's first vice president. And then after he was first vice president, he left the vice presidency, but Maine sent him back to the Senate. He spent 12 more years there, became chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. On the floor, he denounced that 15-passenger bill. And he said, I shall vote against this measure. And I leave that vote the last legacy to my children, that they may esteem it the brightest act of my life. Okay. Every state is entitled to 2 statues in the Capitol building to honor their prime citizens, so we say. And one of Maine's is the statue of Hannibal Hamlin. It's in Statuary Hall, just outside the present House chamber. And when the Judy Chu resolution passed in 2012, I took Judy Chu into Statuary Hall. I showed her the statue of Hannibal Hamlin, and I said, please do not ever look at that statue the same way again, because that is a great man, and today we have redeemed his principles. And that night, when I left the building, I went back by the Hamlin statue one more time, and I put my hand on his shoe. And I had 3 words for him, which were, thank you, Senator. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story. I would be happy for questions.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this so informative talk. And no matter how many times we hear it, we always learn something new. I wanted to just, I know we don't have much time left, right? So I'm going to kind of fold both of the questions that we have in store into one here. First, I just want to ask, for you to share with us what inspired you to be involved to help to get the Congress to pass the resolution of regret for the Chinese exclusion laws, and also why then? And then if you might just talk a little bit about, in the contemporary times, what all these different things that had happened means now, and how we together could make this moment a pivotal moment for transformation as we are seeing rise in anti-Asian hate.
The first one is much easier than the second. It's me personally, right? Listen, I'm the grandson of immigrants, right? I was very, very close to my Russian grandfather. I understood exactly, he came to the United States not for economic reasons, he came to the United States for religious persecution reasons. He was a Jew, and in Russia, that was not a comfortable thing to be. So I understood what it meant to him to have religious freedom and to have political freedom. I understood exactly what it was for him to be an American. And he became a citizen of this country just as quickly as he could become one. But when he came at the end of 1907, he was 20 years old. He had no English, no particular skills that were of matter to the American economy. He went to night school to learn English, and he worked in the garment industry, blah, blah. If he had been Chinese, he had all those opportunities because he was a European. If he had been Chinese at that exact moment in time, he probably could not have gotten through the net of exclusion. And even if he had, under a narrow exception, he could not have become a citizen. Very simple proposition is, what was good enough for him should have been good enough for them. That's it. It's not more complicated than that. And I never did any of this work without keeping him in mind. And I never had any question whatsoever in my mind about what he would have thought about it. Okay? That's the easy question. The other question is harder, but I will go back to William Stewart. If they had been voters, you know, they had political rights. Right? If they had made their voices a mechanism to make their voices heard, okay, we would not have acted against them. Couldn't have acted against them. Or Oliver Morton. We can't leave them exposed like this because, right? So look, the motives for these kinds of ignorant behaviors can change over time, but fundamentally, the point still remains that there is a mechanism, apart from education programs, which are terribly important, but there's also a mechanism to fight back. I mean, to be heard in the political system, and I would argue, by the way, with substantially enhanced political activism, and I would also argue in both parties. It cannot be a circumstance where one party is in and that's great, the other party is in and it's horrendous. I mean, it needs to be said across party lines that certain things are American and are consistent with the Constitution and are consistent with the Declaration of Independence, just like Hannibal Hamlin said, just like George Bush said. And if those things are not observed, okay, then the country is not true to itself. And so therefore, system needs to accommodate a response. So I think in any case, the response to the ignorance in part is education, but it's also political activism, I would judge, okay? Using rights that if they had been available in the first place would have prevented a lot of grief and a lot of misery for a whole lot of people. Can't hear you, Helen. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Thank you so much for just your response. I wonder if anyone else in the room might have any comments or want to, ask a question to Martin before we sign off from today's gathering. Al, I see your hand.
Yes, Mr. Gold. I was just very curious in the matter of the slide about the Wong Kim Ark versus the United States.
Yes, yes.
In the current issue of National Geographic History magazine, there's an article about Wong Kim Ark, and in it refers to the case as United States versus Wong Kim Ark, and not Wong Kim Ark versus United States. Which kind of makes a difference. Who's the plaintiff and who's the defendant?
Makes a difference who the plaintiff is. Yes. Well, thank you. I will check that because I depending on where in the litigative process it goes, it flips. Who's the original plaintiff and who's the appellant and the appellee and all that kind of stuff. But I will check it. But I have always known that case to be Wong Kim Ark versus United States. But
thank you.
Possibly because when the litigation was initially filed, he may have been the plaintiff.
Right. Anyway, it's the National Geographic History magazine.
Thank you very much. No, let me say this to you. I mean, when the House acted in 1902, that case was 4 years old. That decision was 4 years old. And this big debate happened in the House, and they said, "Don't you know that if you pass this legislation in this form, it violates what the Supreme Court just said?" And Congressman Clark says, "I know that. I know that, right?" And they were wrong. And his basic position was that the only people meant to be covered by the 14th Amendment were the people who had been slaves. Okay? and nobody else, which of course is not what the 14th Amendment says, but that was his position. And so therefore you have efforts to reignite all of that case, that controversy. And of course, as you know perfectly well, it has come up a number of times since as people think, well, we need to do something about birthright citizenship. Still good law though, that case. But thank you for pointing that out. I'll go look it up again. I've always known it to be the way I had it, but perhaps it's opposite.
Thank you for raising that question now. And I do see Bill has a question in the chat, but I see Esther has her hand up. So Esther, you want to go first and then we'll let Bill go.
Yeah, I just want to say hello to Mr. Gold, and I want to congratulate him for getting excellence award from the school that he was teaching, the George Washington University. So congratulations.
That's a current event. It only happened yesterday.
Yes, I saw your wife posting it, so I gotta let my CACA, all the officers know and members know about it.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you,
Congrats
for that shout out and congratulations, everyone. Let's give Martin a big hand.
It's very kind.
That's great. Martin, Bill has a question. Bill, you want to go ahead and ask?
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations for organizations that fight for civil liberties? ACLU, would that be a good one?
ACLU is a good one. There's one, I should know this by heart, forgive me. In Los Angeles, Chinese Americans Advancing Justice, I believe. That is based in LA, right? Or maybe it's Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
I think it's AAPI Equity.
AAPI Advancing Justice is the last part of it.
Okay.
It may be Asian Americans.
It is Asian Americans.
It is Asian.
Yes, that's what it is. Yes, exactly. Stewart Cole.
Stewart Cole, yes.
I just Googled it and put a link there. So both of them are good. Thank you.
Oh, both of them are good. Stewart, I mean, the ACLU, of course, is a long-standing organization. Stewart organization does really wonderful work. I did one of these for him, actually, in LA that he hosted, but he's a member of the Committee of 100, and I've known Stewart for a long, long time. I think very highly of him.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I see lots of thank yous popping up in the chat, Martin, for your work. And but feel free if you want to go ahead and share it out loud. Raise your hand, and we'll give you a few minutes to. Yeah, Carolyn, go.
Yes, it's just great to see you again, Martin, and I want to thank you so much for the guidance that you provided us when we were working on Capitol Hill. And because of your help, I think, and your guidance and the contacts you helped us to make, we were able to be successful. And we certainly owe a lot of that success to you. And we want to thank you again.
You are very kind, and it's wonderful to see you always, Carolyn. And I will simply make a statement. And I realize who I'm talking to here, but I'm going to say it anyway. I've done this kind of work working with Congress my whole career. I came to Washington 57 years ago as a young student at American University and went to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration in 1965. So I've been around the city a long while. But no work that I have ever done, and this is God's honest truth, no work that I have ever done has brought more personal satisfaction than this work. This is the best thing ever, okay? Getting the resolutions through the Senate and through the House, because you perfectly well know, Carolyn, there wasn't a single member of Congress, and I would put Judy Chu in that statement as well, that had much of an idea, if any idea, about this history. It isn't taught, and so, I mean, Judy would know more than most people, but that didn't mean she knew a lot. And I can tell you for a fact, Scott Brown, when he got involved in this, remember, he was from Massachusetts. George Hoerr was from Massachusetts. You go into his office, you see all the pictures of all the senators who from Massachusetts who preceded him, right? And several of them were very prominent people, like Senator Hoerr. And I said to Senator Brown, I said, will you stand in their shoes? Will you stand in their shoes? Because if you will, I said, we've got something for you to do. And he was open to doing it. But so help me, they didn't put the resolutions in until we did all the research down at Covington and Burlingame, you know, and with some help from the organizations. And then before he put it in, he did the right thing. He had it fact checked by the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress came back and said, the facts are right. And then he sponsored it. So we made sure, I didn't want any mistakes in this that could give anybody a reason to say no, because the odd thing about this, I'll just say one more thing here. The simple justice of doing these resolutions is obvious because the injustice was obvious. But what is also correct is that it would have been very, very easy to derail this. One senator objects, and it just never comes to the floor. It just never comes to the floor. It's true. So many things have to really pass by unanimous consent because they won't devote floor time to it because there are too many other priorities and so on and so forth. And in the House as well, if there had been any real controversy, okay? But there were members that stood up, responded to objections when, not so much objections, but misgivings or questions, whatever else it is, tamped down any opposition, right? So in the end, you know how it came out. You know how it came out. But it's like saying, we know how the war ended. It doesn't mean that the war wasn't difficult or couldn't have had a different outcome. So the simple fact is that the credit for this spreads broadly. And I would say the organizations, the CACA and the Committee of 100, OCA, and so who worked on this thing, did a major important thing in terms of getting members of Congress sensitized to all this. We helped to provide the facts, but ultimately, members in Congress have to know one thing. Does this really matter to somebody? You give us a bunch of historical facts. Who cares about them? And if it doesn't matter to somebody, then it doesn't pass anyway. So the facts have to be right, the legislation has to be good, but it also has to matter. And without the work of CACA, OCA, all the organizations, making clear that this did matter, it wouldn't have passed either. So it was the work product of a whole lot of people, not any one party.
And Martin, you put it so well. All this work that has gone on before us, but it means that it propels us to continue the work because the work is not done. Exactly. And you mentioned, getting involved, voting, getting involved in helping our lawmakers to understand, to be educated. And I think, like you also mentioned, is educating the broader public, right? And sure. And Christina, I see you're here, and Christina is our VP for Education. I believe that is one of the big project that we're continuing, is how to ensure that the broader public understands what Martin taught us today, right? Or talked to us about today. So with all that, we just want to give a big shout out to all who came into the room today, and in the chat, Martin, we have people expressing deepest gratitude to you, and a great big thank you to you, and for this very informative and interesting presentation. So Martin, again, let's everyone give Martin a big applause, and thank you for taking time to join us today.
And it's my privilege, everybody, believe me. Thanks to all of you.
Till next time, friends, let's stay healthy and stay well and take care of yourself, and bless you all. Thank you again, Martin.
Thank you.
Bye, Martin.
Bye, Carol. See you now.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.